In Part 1, we covered how Vikings became the medieval world's greatest explorers. Now we re-diving into the moment that changed history, the Viking discovery and settlement of North America around 1000 CE, and let me tell you, this story involves everything you'd expect from Vikings: brutal violence, family feuds, mysterious disappearances, and encounters with indigenous peoples that would set the tone for European Native American relations for centuries to come. Let's start with Bjarni Herjolfsson, because this guy's story shows you just how casually Vikings discovered new continents. Around 985 CE, Bjarni was sailing from Iceland to Greenland to visit his father, a routine voyage that Vikings made regularly. But he got caught in fog and storms, and when the weather cleared, he found himself looking at a coastline that didn't match any known land. Instead of investigating, and this is the part that drives me crazy, he just turned around and sailed back to Greenland. Can you imagine? This guy literally discovered North America and was like, not interested. But Bjarni's story spread through the Greenland settlements, and it caught the attention of someone who was very interested indeed. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red. Now, Leif was everything you'd expect from a Viking explorer: ambitious, fearless, and always looking for the next opportunity. When he heard about land to the west with forests and good soil, he saw potential. Greenland was running short on timber, and the settlements needed new sources of resources. Around 1000 CE, Leif bought Bjarni's ship and assembled a crew of 35 men for what would become the most significant voyage in Viking history. Let me paint you a picture of what this journey was like. You're sailing across 600 miles of some of the most dangerous waters in the world, in a wooden ship with no backup, no rescue services, and no way to communicate with home if something goes wrong. The Davis Strait between Greenland and North America is filled with icebergs, violent storms, and currents that can smash your ship against rocks without warning. The first land they reached, Leif called Helgeland, Slab Land, which was probably Baffin Island. It was nothing but rock and ice, so they kept sailing south. Next came Markland, Forest Land, likely Labrador, where they found the timber they desperately needed but no suitable place for settlement. Finally, they reached what Leif called Vinland Wineland, probably somewhere in Newfoundland or the Maritime Provinces. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting. Vinland wasn't just a place Vikings visited. They established a permanent settlement there. Workshops, and even a forge. They weren't just exploring. They were colonizing North America 5 centuries before Columbus was even born. But let me tell you about the indigenous peoples they encountered, because this is where Viking expansion took a dark turn. The Vikings called them Skrallings, a derogatory term that probably meant wretches or screechers. These were likely ancestors of the Inuit Beothuk, or Micmac peoples, who had been living in North America for thousands of years. The Viking sagas describe them as skilled warriors who fought with bows and arrows, but also as potential trading partners. The first encounters were actually peaceful. The sagas describe Vikings trading red cloth and iron tools for furs and other goods. But here's the thing about Vikings. They had a hair trigger when it came to violence. One saga describes how a Viking bull got loose and charged toward a group of indigenous people, terrifying them because they had never seen cattle before. This led to a misunderstanding that quickly escalated into warfare. The violence that followed shows you just how brutal Viking warfare could be. The sagas describe battles where Vikings used their superior iron weapons and armor to slaughter indigenous warriors armed with stone-tipped arrows. The Vikings might win individual battles, but they were always outnumbered and far from reinforcements. Let me tell you about Freydis Eriksdottir, Leif's half-sister, because her story shows you just how savage Viking expansion could get. Freydis led her own expedition to Vinland, and according to the sagas, she was absolutely ruthless. When conflicts arose within her own crew, she had 5 women killed with an axe. Personally, she was pregnant at the time and supposedly encouraged her men in battle by exposing her breasts and slapping them with a sword. This wasn't just Viking machismo. This was psychological warfare designed to terrify enemies. The indigenous people's response to Viking settlement was sophisticated and effective. They used guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run attacks, and their knowledge of local conditions to make Viking settlement unsustainable. They would attack Viking expeditions when they were most vulnerable, while hunting, gathering wood, or exploring inland. The Vikings found themselves constantly under siege, unable to expand their settlements or establish secure supply lines. Here is something that really shows you the brutality of these encounters. The Vikings started taking indigenous slaves. The sagas mention capturing and enslaving indigenous people, though they don't go into detail about the process. But we know from Viking practices elsewhere that this would have involved extreme violence, family separation, and the complete destruction of indigenous communities. The Vikings weren't just exploring, they were engaging in systematic conquest and exploitation. The failure of Viking settlement in North America came down to numbers and logistics. The Greenland colony that supplied the North American expeditions never had more than about 3,000 people total. They were trying to establish and maintain settlements across hundreds of miles of ocean while also dealing with hostile indigenous populations. Every expedition to Vinland required massive resources: ships, men, supplies, weapons, and the returns weren't worth the investment. Unlike later European colonization, which completely transformed Native American societies, the Viking presence was too brief and limited to cause major changes. Indigenous peoples in the areas where Vikings settled continued their traditional ways of life for centuries after the last Viking ship sailed away. The Vikings themselves were changed by their North American experience, though. They brought back new knowledge about navigation, different types of wood, and indigenous technologies. Some Vikings may have settled permanently in North America, intermarrying with indigenous peoples and disappearing from European history. The sagas hint at this but don't provide details, leaving us to wonder about Vikings who chose to stay in the New World. The psychological impact on Viking culture was significant. The failure to establish permanent settlements in North America marked the beginning of the end of Viking expansion. For centuries, Vikings had been pushing boundaries, discovering new lands, and establishing colonies wherever they went. North America was the first place they encountered resistance they couldn't overcome, people they couldn't conquer or displace. The last recorded Viking expedition to North America was in 1347, when a ship was blown off course and ended up at Markland. By then, the Greenland settlements were in decline, the Viking Age was ending, and European attention was turning toward other forms of exploration and conquest. The Viking discovery of North America became a footnote in Icelandic sagas, forgotten by the rest of Europe until the 19th century. But the Vikings had achieved something remarkable. They had crossed the Atlantic Ocean, established settlements in North America, and made contact with indigenous peoples centuries before any other Europeans. They had proven that the Atlantic was not an impassable barrier, that new worlds existed beyond the known horizon, and that human beings could adapt and survive in even the most challenging environments. In next part, we'll explore what happened to the Viking settlements in North America, why they ultimately failed, and how their legacy influenced later European exploration of the New World. We also look at the archaeological evidence that proves that Viking presence and the ongoing mysteries that still puzzle historians today.